Let's talk in some words about chorus fracture. And sorry for the English, for the sluggish English, but let's talk about chorus fracture, and you will forgive me about the mistake I make in English. So chorus fracture is a fracture of the distal radius. When the distal radius is a fracture, the mechanism is usually falling on an outstretched hand. You can see the mechanism just here. The part of the distal radius that is fractured usually goes forward, namely, there is a displacement that is volar or ventral if you want. Don't forget to look also on the ulna, it may be broken also. What is important to know in cornea fracture that it is usually extra-articular fracture, but usually is not always. Sometimes the fracture, like you see here, goes and gets into the articular cartilage, like in here, and becomes an intra-articular fracture, which means it is more dangerous fracture, maybe with more complications like osteoarthritis. You need to look for the displacement. Remember, 2 millimeter of displacement with intra-articular fracture is a problem. So in coarse fracture, usually it's extra-articular, but look for the intra-articular involvement. So sometimes it also called silver fog deformity. Why? Because if you look at someone with coarse fracture like here, and you look on a fork here, this image is good. So this is how a coarse fracture looks in reality. And you can think why it looks like this. Here's the distal radius, it goes volarly, it goes dorsally, and we get this deformity. And it looks like a fork, and it looks like a fork. So that's why it also called silver fork deformity. Okay, so don't forget to look for the intra-articular fracture. Don't forget to look for the distal radial-ulnar joint. Here, you can look at this Colles fracture. You can see the fracture goes to the intra-articular cartilage, goes to the dorsal radial-ulnar joint. There is a styloid ulnar uh, fracture. And also look where the ulna is. It touches the lunate bone. It shouldn't, but it touches. Why it happens? Because the radius is shortened. Look, if I would have calculate now the radial inclination or radial angle, I will see that the radial angle is surely become very short with this fracture. This shortening causes the ulna to touch the lunate bone, and it causes more loading on the lunate. And so when we are talking about Colles fracture, okay, so mostly, usually, it's an extra-articular stable fracture, but you need to look for those three things that we looked on. Intra-articular radiocarpal or dorsal-radio-ulnar joint extension of the fracture. We saw it in this image. Radial shortening, you can see the radius is shortened. And just to remind you, here is the normal length of the radius from the DURJ, dorsal-radio-ulnar joint, to the styloid process of the radius. It should be 10 to 13 millimeters, but obviously with the fracture we see here, it shortened. Of course, not always coarse fracture causes this, but it's just an example. Loss of radial inclination, and this is the angle we saw here. And when there is loss of radial inclination, the lunate becomes more loaded, and the ulna might touch the lunate bone. And all this should be described in the report, not just say coarse fracture. We need also this in the report. Okay, so Fuchs mechanism, dorsal displacement of the radius, silver fork deformity, usually extra-articular stable, sometimes intra-articular, with shortening, with losing of inclination, with ulnar fractures. So look for this. And this is using radiology assistant some words about Colles fracture. Thank you. If there is any corrections, please write. Sorry for the English, and that's it.